And you've covered Daniel 2 a lot of times in your children's Bible classes. But there is so much that's here. Now as we get started thinking about Daniel 2, remember what we covered last week when we looked at Daniel chapter 1. Daniel and his 3 friends have been brought out of Jerusalem, and they've been brought into captivity. Things are looking rough. Parents are killed, temples destroyed, their whole people are just wiped out. And so many times, if somebody had gone through that kind of trauma, they would lose their faith very quickly. The Babylonians call Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in, and they begin to kind of judge them. And they change their names, try to make them atheists. They change their diet and their dress to try to make them Babylonians. And so they're trying to force them to change cultures, to leave who they were. And Daniel is fiercely determinative that he is not going to change. And so he asks for a special provision. He does it in a polite way, not a rude way, in order to continue eating what he eats, asks for vegetables and water. And the Lord blesses him over those 10 days. And so he's allowed to keep some part of his identity. And so that's an important thing that we notice, is he's allowed to keep his identity. Now, here we are, as we start in chapter 2, second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, second year of the time which we're here. And we're going to see a dream that's had. Now, as I said last week, the first 6 chapters of Daniel are written to the entire world. And that's the reason it's written in an Aramaic language in its original. The last 7 to 12 are written for the Hebrew people. So it's in Hebrew, and it's also in what's called apocalyptic or symbolic literature, which means it has a lot of symbols, and you kind of have to be familiar with God and familiar with the Word of God in order to be able to understand. And so these first 6 chapters, you're going to see in every chapter, but chapter 5 says it and implies it, but every chapter is going to have a verse, in chapter 2 is verse 47, that says, truly, the God of Israel is the God Most High. He is the one who really matters. He's the one who's there. And even though chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, each stands alone, each of them are teaching a similar lesson. God is in charge. Now, it didn't look like it today, because at the time, God's people are in slavery. God's people are not at home. God's temple's destroyed. And so it would look to you and I like, well, if God's so powerful, he wouldn't have allowed this to happen. If God's so great, why would this be going on? Well, God is in charge. And we're going to see that in every single chapter. So let's start chapter 2, and let's take a chunk of it. Let me read verses 1 through 13, okay? Now, in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. This is New King James I'm reading from. And his spirit was so troubled, his sleep left him. And the king gave the command to call all the magicians, astrologers, sorcerers, and Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. And so they came and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we'll give the interpretation. Now remember last chapter, these men were brought from wherever it may be, and Daniel and his crew were brought in, and they were taught the language and they were taught the ways. This is much what in modern days we would call astrology. You would either look at the stars and count how the planets were aligned to be able to prophesy about the truth, or they would kill usually a goat or some beast, and they would begin looking at the intestines and the liver and be able to interpret and decide. And so these magicians and astrologers are from the world over. They've been brought to be taught how to interpret, how to tell the future. And so Nebuchadnezzar has tried to bring all the world together and all the world's magicians and astrologers to be able to be a secret weapon. And so now he's had a dream. And he calls all these people together and he says, okay, imagine if you've paid for all these people to be educated. Okay, now I need you. And guess what? They're not going to be able to do a thing about it. this education in astrology, this education in how to tell the future by looking at different things like this, it's not worth it. And so that's what's going on. So he says, okay, I need you to tell me about the dream. And so in verse 4 they say, okay, good. Tell us the dream and we'll give the interpretation. Nebuchadnezzar says in verse 5, the king answered, said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. If you do not make the dream known to me and its interpretation, you're going to be cut in pieces and your house shall be made into an ash heap. However, if you tell me the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and the interpretation. Verse 7, they answered again and said, well, tell us the dream, we'll give you the interpretation. Verse 8, the king answered and says, I know for certain you would gain time because you see my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time is changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. Now look at verse 10. Verse 10 is one of the keys of this chapter. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things, any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It's a difficult thing the king requests, and there are no other who can tell it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. All right, you see what's going on here. Nebuchadnezzar kind of knows what's up. If he tells them the dream, they're going to interpret it in a way that the king likes to hear. And they're going to fake their way through it, whatever it might be. And Nebuchadnezzar knows this is a habit these people have, so he says, all right, to make sure that you're really talking to the gods, so make sure that this astrology thing works and this other thing works, you're going to tell me my dream, and then you're going to tell me what it means. That way I know that what you're saying is true. And he says, if you don't tell it to me, I'm going to take every one of you, rip you limb to limb, and I'm going to destroy your houses. Now, he is obviously he's obviously going to do something like that, because when you look in 2 Kings 25, verse 7, he took Zedekiah, tortured him, the king of Judah, and you see where even in the next chapter, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't do what he wants, he decides to throw them into a fiery furnace. So he is a very ferocious king. And so what he said, he's going to do. And they know it. But I love that response that they give back. King, people can't do this. You're asking us to do something that's impossible because this is something that can only be done by God. You see the foreshadowing going on there? There's some major foreshadowing, which is happening. Only God can do this. And so guess what God's about to do? He's about to step in, and he is about to do it. And this is about to occur and to happen. And so the king is angry, he's furious, and he gives the command to destroy everybody, if you go down to verse 12 and 13. And so they go around. Now, as they're going around, beginning to get ready to kill all these people, in verse 13, they go and they find Daniel and his companions. Daniel has not been present. He's probably not been promoted. He's probably still kind of considered a refugee, even though he's a royal from another nation. Daniel is confronted, and they say, okay, we're going to kill everybody. And Daniel says, why? What's going on? He didn't even know anything was happening. And so they began to tell the king and all these things. So if you look at verse 16, Daniel says, give me time. Give me enough time so I can go pray to God, and so my friends can go pray to God. So they go and they begin to pray. And we see that in verse 16 and 17, that the mercies of God may be revealed. And so they begin to pray. And as you look there in verse 19, God appears in a night vision, and he tells him what it is that's going to happen. Now, this is a little bit on the side, but I think it's interesting to know. If you look there in verse 18, you see a term, the God of heaven. You're going to see that in verse 19, the God of heaven. You're going to see that over in verse 37, the God of heaven. And you're going to see over in verse 44, the God of heaven. As a matter of fact, when you get to Ezra and Nehemiah and many of the minor prophets that are post-exilic or after the exile, you're going to see that title, the God of Heaven. Now, yes, it's used in the book of Numbers, but it's specifically used oftentimes during the exile and right after the exile. Why? Well, these people, they had lost their land. They had lost their temple. No matter where you go on this earth, you're always under heaven. And so the point that they're making when they use this title is it doesn't matter where I'm at. It doesn't matter what captivity I'm in. It doesn't matter what's happened to my people. God is always over me. God is always in charge. And God is always going to be there. And so Daniel says a prayer. And in this prayer, he thanks the Lord for the things which have happened, for giving him the answer. And then he goes to Arioch, who is the secretary to the king, and says, bring me to the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation. And so as he comes in, but notice in verse 28, he gives the credit to God. He doesn't take the credit for himself, but he gives the credit to God. Now, what is the dream that we've had? Well, you know, it's a picture of a statue. And it's not like any statue that we would ever make, because this statue would be otherworldly, because it wouldn't work together very well. And it really wouldn't look very good either. But you know the statue. There's a great statue, and its head is gold. Its chest and arms are silver. Its belly and thighs are made of bronze. Its legs are made of iron. And at the very bottom of his legs, the feet are made of iron and clay. In other words, they don't stick together very well at all. And so as you begin reading through that, you see this interesting picture which is there. And so he describes this and everything. And as he describes it, you see in verse 35 that the iron, the clay, the silver are all, well, we'll go a little bit earlier. All right. Verse 34, a stone is created. A stone that is made without hands. And it strikes the statues, strikes the idol, strikes the image on the feet of iron and clay. And it breaks it into pieces. And the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold are crushed together. And they become like chaff and blow away in the wind. And the stone that struck the image begins to grow, and it fills the entire world. All right, so what you see there is a fascinating picture. Now the question that he has to answer, what does this mean? Well, what does this mean? Well, here's the interpretation. Verse 37, you king are king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field of heaven, he has given them into your hand, has given you rule over them all. And so, Nebuchadnezzar, you are this head of gold. All right? But after you shall rise another kingdom, and this kingdom will be inferior. It's not gold, it's silver. And then another, a kingdom of bronze, shall rule over all the earth. And then a fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks into pieces and shatters everything. And that iron crushes that kingdom. That kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. And then you see the potter's clay, which will be added to it, into the ceramic clay. And the toes of the feet were partly iron, partly of clay. And so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. And you see where that's destroyed. Now those toes, the emphasis is on the 10 toes, and we'll see later in the book there's an emphasis on the 10 kings, which are there as well. That all comes to be fairly interesting stuff. And so now the important question is, what does this colossal image represent? First point I want us to make is Nebuchadnezzar hears the message and he doesn't like it. Because you go to chapter 3, and what does Nebuchadnezzar make?
Golden king.
Yeah, golden king. He makes his own statue, and it is huge. It is huge, humongous, almost 90 feet tall, all gold. And so what is he saying in chapter 3? I've had this vision. God told me how things are going to go. I'm king. This is how it's going to be. I rule everything. I'm not going to share with anybody. This whole gold statue all represents me. So you see a little bit of Nebuchadnezzar's rebellion as you get to chapter 3. But that's next week, Lord willing. We're going to focus on chapter 2 this week. Nebuchadnezzar, you're here. Another kingdom's going to arise, and then another kingdom, and then a powerful kingdom. And what you see is the value of these kingdoms goes down. Gold is worth more than silver. Silver is worth more than bronze. And bronze is worth more than iron. And iron is worth more than anything made of iron and clay. But if you look at it from the other direction, you got gold up here. Gold is more valuable. It's not as strong as silver. Silver is not as strong as bronze. Bronze is not as strong as iron. But then it begins to fall apart at the end with the iron and the clay. So the value goes down. The strength goes up as you go through it. Now, if you were to talk to a Jewish person who really didn't like Jesus and did not want to look at the idea of a coming Messiah, this is what he would tell you in chapter 2. It falls apart in chapter 7. Here's what he would tell you in chapter 2. The gold represents, as you look at this gold here, excuse me, it represents Nebuchadnezzar. And then you go, and then you have Belshazzar, which is he is kind of a cousin, kind of a grandson, depending on how you do that. It's an inferior kingdom. And then he loses it, and it goes to the Medes, Darius. And then you look at Darius, and then you have this issue with the iron. He's strong. And then you go to Xerxes or Cyrus, and that would be the bottom. And then the kingdom falls apart. God works to send his children back home after the exile. That would be the traditional Jewish interpretation. And if you squint hard enough, it works, maybe, but it sure doesn't work when you get to chapter 7, which is a parallel here. The best interpretation which you run across is the one which you learned in Bible class, because it's true. The gold represents Babylon. After the king of Babylon, we'll see the Medes and the Persians, which will come in. After the Medes and the Persians, you're going to see Alexander the Great, who will come across. And after Alexander the Great comes across, then you'll see the power and the might of Rome. And in the days of those kings, chapter 2 and verse 44, God shall establish his stone. And a stone shall strike and break into pieces every kingdom, and it shall grow and it shall take over the world. Sounds a whole lot like Acts 17, right? God determines the bounds and the directions of every nation, and he determines it for his purpose. And so what you're seeing here in Daniel chapter 2, God is creating his kingdom. God is creating his world to be exactly what he wants it to be. I think that's the best example, or the best thing which you see there as you run across that, and as you look at that closely to see what it is that we're learning. Now, taking a step back from that, there's two directions I want to go in the time we have remaining. Taking a step back from that, here's what I want us to see. On the surface, from Nebuchadnezzar's mind, he was in charge. These Jewish people were so insignificant. They didn't compare to the Egyptians or to the Assyrians. These great kingdoms he had taken over, Jerusalem was just kind of there. And so he probably did not even know about Daniel and his three friends. And so on his level, he ruled, and God, the God of the Hebrews, he's just one of the pantheon, and if he was so great, then, that God would be ruling. But under the surface, God, as Galatians would tell us, the fullness of time, is working things the way that he wants to work things. Now, where that's significant as we bring it to today is sometimes we look around, and I can't tell you how many books I've read, even books written in the 1860s, 1930s, 1960s, which have talked about how the church is struggling and it will not be around at all in the next generation. We've been saying that for hundreds of years. Because when we look on the surface level, it looks like God's people are just being overwhelmed. It looks like unless we conform to the world, we have no chance. And it looks like there's just no hope. But under the surface, God is moving along things the way he wants them to move. He is accomplishing the things that he wants to accomplish. God is there. We can't see him necessarily in world events. You can't say, oh, there, I see it right there. This happened over in the Middle East, or this happened in Russia, or this happened in Washington. But we do know that God's in charge. And God is doing things the way that he wants to do. Now, the other thing I want us to notice, and I've brought this up before, but I think it's good to bring it up again, is what I call biblical math. Okay? Biblical math. And here you go. Ready? Now, if you're a school teacher or a math teacher, one of my sons is going to be a math teacher, he would get upset with me because it's not math, but it's spiritual math. You ready? 2 plus 2 plus 2 is equal to 2. Okay? Remember that. 2 plus 2 plus 2 is equal to 2. Let me explain to you what I mean. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 44, in the days of those kings. Now you compare Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, you see that is the kingdom of Rome. So this stone shall be established during the days of the Roman Empire. So you open up Luke chapter 1, you begin looking at verse 6, 5 and 6. And you see in the days of King Augustus, a census was called. And so Jesus is living on this earth during the time of the Roman Empire. Here comes that stone during the government which God predicted hundreds of years before. Okay, that's your first 2. Your second 2 comes out of Isaiah 2. And as you read Isaiah 2, you see that out of Zion shall come forth the law. In other words, outside the city of Jerusalem shall be spoken the new covenant and the new law. So you see in Daniel 2, it's going to happen during the time of the Roman Empire. And Isaiah 2, you see that it's going to start and come forth from the city of Jerusalem. Then you look at the minor prophet Joel. And you begin reading in Joel chapter 2. And you see in Joel chapter 2 that on that day, the fiery day of the Lord, he's talking about when the Lord returns, it's going to come with the power of Spirit. Those great, powerful words. And so you got Daniel 2, Roman Empire, Isaiah 2, Jerusalem, Joel, power of the Spirit. 2 plus 2 plus 2 is equal to Acts chapter 2. Because we get to Acts chapter 2, you see where Peter stands up on the portico of Solomon's temple. And as he begins to speak, he's speaking in the city of Jerusalem. And Peter begins quoting scripture in his sermon. He quotes Psalm. Where else? Joel chapter 2. Because as these men were sitting in a room, fire appeared above their heads and a great amplifies the power of the Spirit. And the Spirit baptizes, immerses them, and they begin to speak forth in the tongues of the people. The power of the Spirit is there. 2 plus 2 plus 2 is equal to Acts chapter 2. That's a significant, interesting way of looking at Scripture and seeing the power of prophecy. But take a step back and ask, why does it matter? Why does God want to do these things? Is this just something which we would say, this is trivia? During the days of Isaiah, the kingdom's falling apart. Jerusalem has become very insignificant. Everything revolves around Egypt, revolves around Assyria, and revolves around Babylon. And yet Isaiah says, Jerusalem's going to matter. It's going to matter. In worldly terms, it did. But in God's terms, he made it matter. You look at the book of Joel, you see the coming destruction. And you see where worldliness will be put to an end. And Joel says it's going to happen because of God's power. You might think it's hopeless, but God's power will overcome. In Daniel, you see the insignificance of the kingdom. But the worldly kingdoms will fall, and God's kingdom shall reign forever. And you put all those things together, and suddenly you see these 12 men who are fishermen and tax collectors and zealots, people who are not politicians or great generals, but God changes the world with that stone which is there. Upon this rock I will build my church. Does that sound familiar? The gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. What is that stone? That stone is the fact that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. That stone is the fact that God is in charge, and God will determine how things work and how things roll. It's a fascinating thing to see this. This stone, supernatural in origin is super powerful. It destroys the state, and it's worldwide. It will fill the world. It's fascinating to see all these things as they work together. Another point which I read across in the commentaries I was studying for this lesson. As you go through Daniel chapter 2, after each kingdom, there's a phrase, after this. Nebuchadnezzar thought his kingdom would last forever. And God said, after this. Cyrus thought his kingdom would last forever. And God said, after this. Alexander the Great conquered the world and put his 4 generals in charge because he didn't trust his own children, because he wanted his kingdom to last forever. And God said, after this. Rome ruled the world. And God once again says, after this. I love my country. I love our form of government. I love what our country does the world over. I think even though it may have blemishes, it's done a lot of good. But you and I have got to realize, compared to the church, this country will have an after this. It's not all about the U.S. It's about God. And God's kingdom shall be established and shall absolutely remain forever. So let's read verse 46 through 49. Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel, and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. The king answered Daniel and said, truly, your God, here we go, this is going to come. All 6 chapters of Belshazzar in chapter 5 didn't say this, mainly because he died. But it was proven that God was in charge because he died. So verse 47, here's our first one, okay? Truly your God is the God of gods, Lord of lords, and is a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal the secret. And the king promoted Daniel and gave him the many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men. And Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. He got his guy and put him exactly where he needed to be. Put him exactly where he needed to be. So often we go through life and we may feel insignificant. You may feel like life has done this or that or whatever else it may be. God has set you exactly where you need to be. Because it's from the spot that you're at that you can change the world. It may just be with the spouse. It may just be with your children. It may just be with your participation in church services. But God has set you where you need to be. God has infiltrated the great kingdom of Babylon with his men so that he can influence and control where Nebuchadnezzar is going to go. And so for the rest of the book, we're going to see that God's people are where they need to be in order for God's kingdom and God's work to go on. Today, God has placed you and I exactly where we need to be so that God's work and God's kingdom can remain forever. So what you see in Daniel chapter 2, as he opens up, you see this powerful, powerful prophecy about the church which is coming. But you also see God's work in everyday folks. God's work, and they may not have known everything, but they trusted in God, they prayed to God, and God took care of them, and God helped them. Today, you and I, we are part of the most powerful kingdom which has ever been created. It's God's kingdom. It's God's church. And every day we go about doing God's work, living the way he wants us to live, doing the things that he wants us to do, so that we can always be faithful to him.